I was a park ranger station and a fire tower. It had a strange set of rules. When I first got the job, I couldn't believe my luck. I was a very solitary person. I loved to read and be alone. When I saw an ad for a park ranger manning a fire tower, I just about jumped out of my skin. Working overnight at a Walmart was exactly the best job in the world. There are some stories I could tell about that as well, but I applied for the job and was ecstatic that I got it. They made me do a week of training before my first shift. Most of it was dry reading and making sure I was qualified in CPR. They showed me the job's ins and outs, and then I followed in my car as we drove to the tower. In the middle of the day, it was inspiring to stare up at the underside of the tower looming above me, suspended high in the air by the metal pylons. Once I started climbing the narrow metal stairs with hints of rust at the edges, I was somewhat less than excited. In fact, I was terrified. I don't like heights very much. It's not like I go all vertigo or anything. It's just I prefer to stay on the ground. Once we reached the top and pushed open the trapdoor to get onto the deck that surrounded the tower, I was doing a little better. I opened the door that led into the tower's interior. Looking around the room made me forget all about the terrible climb. It was like a small apartment. There was a small refrigerator, sink, counter, cupboards, and a small table. In the center of the room was a table with a map permanently attached to it. Of course, there were windows all around. There was a 360-degree view, as you would expect for a fire tower in the middle of a state park. The view was absolutely amazing. I could see the peaks and valleys for miles in every direction. It was a photographer's dream. The other ranger explained what was expected of me. We worked 24-hour shifts, so there would be times I would have to sleep. But I had to set an alarm and get up to scan for problems at least once per hour during the night. During daytime hours, I had to scan every 30 minutes. There was a radio to report any trouble and a phone in case I needed to call the fire department. In my mind, I was already drooling at the thought of getting paid to take amazing pictures and sit around reading books. The ranger told me that it was extremely important that I read the rule book first thing. He asked if I had any questions, and I said no. He reinforced that I could not leave the tower no matter what until I was relieved. I followed him down the narrow staircase to get my supplies from my car. He got in his truck and hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say something else. But then he shut the door, wished me well, and drove away. It took me 3 trips to get all my stuff up to the top. At home, it's nothing to bring a few boxes of groceries into the house. Here it became life and death. I was near the top with the box in front of me when I stumbled on one of the narrow steps and nearly fell over the side. I paused for a long moment to regain my balance before continuing to the top. It suddenly struck me that this job might not be the cakewalk I thought it was. I pushed that thought to the back of my mind and went for my next 2 loads. Basic supplies, books, phone chargers, camera occupied the second and last trips. Once I was up for good, I collapsed into the chair. I was on my way to Napland when I heard static on the radio. I jumped up and grabbed it. "Hello," I said, but no one answered. I figured this was the ranger's subtle way of reminding me it was time to do a check. But lugging 3 loads up the tiny stairs of death had put a serious crimp in my fire watch time. In fact, it had been nearly an hour since the other ranger had left. I did my slow pen around a room, checking each part of the forest for smoke and seeing none. Having successfully completed my first go-around, I celebrated with a bottle of water while I put the groceries away. The cupboards weren't empty, but they weren't a gourmet's delight either. Nearly a full shelf of baked beans didn't exactly thrill me, but I had the supplies that should do me for a few shifts. I sat the bread on the counter and loaded the cold cuts in the fridge. I would get some more options the next time I went shopping. By the time I finished putting things away, it was time for another check. The sun was starting to set, so I grabbed my camera and took some amazing pictures. I couldn't wait to upload them to my computer at home. As I looked around the room, my eyes landed on the manual. I realized I hadn't read it yet. I sighed and took it over to the chair. I was sure it would have me out cold in no time. As I opened the book, a piece of notebook paper fell out. I picked it up and read the real rules. Never, under any circumstances, leave the fire tower until you are relieved. Turn off all lights between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. If you receive a radio transmission or phone call between those hours, do not answer. If anyone knocks on the trapdoor during those hours, tell them they'll have to wait until morning. Do not open the door. If you see a glowing object floating toward the tower, don't look at it. Cover your eyes and count to 50. When you open your eyes, it should be gone. If not, cover and count to 50 again. If animals surround the tower, don't go down to look. Fire your flare gun into the air twice, 1 minute apart. Then lock yourself in the bathroom and hope for the best. I sat the note down and stared at it. Was this a joke? Were they having some fun with the new guy? I wasn't looking forward to getting hazed at 2 o'clock in the morning. I put the note back in the book and skimmed through the manual. It was a real snooze fest of standard rules and nonsense. For the next check, I decided to use binoculars. I was rewarded by seeing a bear and 3 deer. I pulled out my camera and took some pics, but the zoom wasn't quite as much as I needed to get some really good shots. You could still tell it was a bear, but it was a little blurry. I decided to go camera shopping with my first paycheck. What's the use of having this spectacular view if I can't take good pictures of it? Soon after sunset came the twilight. The sky lit up a brilliant orange. I took some more pictures and did my scan. I was just about to go back inside when I noticed a thin wisp of smoke in the distance. I grabbed my binoculars and tried to get a better view, but there were too many trees in the way. I pulled out my compass and got a general direction, then grabbed the radio and called the ranger on duty. I told him I had a fire and gave him the direction and general distance. He acknowledged and said he would check it out. I stayed glued to my binoculars, waiting to see the smoke lessen. Minutes seemed to each take an eternity as the smoke continued to rise. Nearly a half hour later, the radio came to life. "Hey, rookie," the ranger said. "Did you find it? Did you put it out? I still see smoke. Did I tell you the wrong place?" I said into the radio all in one breath. "Oh, there," he said. "Everything's fine. It was just a campfire." "Oh, what? A campfire," he said. "Nothing to worry about." "A campfire," I repeated in a daze. "Yeah, you'll want to see more smoke, and it should be a lot thicker and darker before you call it in." I stood in silence, my face beat red with embarrassment. "Cheer up," the ranger said into the silence, At least you didn't call the fire department." I looked over at the phone, knowing I was mere minutes from doing that very thing. "Yeah, thanks," I said. "Sorry about that." "Don't worry, kid," he said. "At least you erred on the side of caution instead of letting the forest burn down." I put my face in my palm and shook my head. So much for a good first impression. Twilight had faded, leaving a few last vestiges of light as the clouds transformed from dirty gray to black. I began to realize just how alone I was out here when the canopy of the night fully fell. Doing my checks from inside was nearly impossible. I had lights on, and every window I looked out of became a mirror of me looking back and at myself. Alone in a wooden box suspended 100 feet above the ground made it that much creepier. I stepped out onto the deck in the cool evening air. The total darkness was oppressive. I couldn't see anything. How was I supposed to see smoke? I did a slow walk around the deck, looking out blindly at the trees. As my eyes adjusted, I was able to make out some shapes of the mountains and even the soft glow and the distance of the nearest town. That was small comfort to know that things still existed out in the world, and I hadn't been plunged into this cover of darkness. I finished my check and stepped back inside. After being out in the darkness, it was way too bright. I turned off the main overhead light and the light over the entrance. The room settled into a comfortable glow with enough light to see, but not blind. In fact, it was a little too cozy. I felt a nap coming on. I laid down on the surprisingly comfortable cot and closed my eyes. I woke some time later to static sounding on the radio. I reached for the radio to answer, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. I looked at my watch, and it said to 12 a.m. I froze. Looking around the lit room, I thought about the strange rules I had read earlier. I reached up and turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. As my eyes adjusted and I could see a few things, I looked out the window and could swear I saw someone peering in at me. Just then I heard static on the radio. There was a voice trying to get through, but it seemed too weak. I waited to see if they would call again. A minute later, static sounded again. Beneath it, I heard the voice. It was a little stronger this time. I could just make it out. "Help me," it said in a feeble yet insistent voice. I reached for the radio, but something made me glance at my watch first. It was to 23 a.m. I faltered and didn't answer. Those creepy rules, I thought. What if they're real? I've already broken one by having the lights on. What happens when you break the rules? I sat in silence, wanting to know the answer, but at the same time not wanting to know. The radio call came through much more clearly this time. "Help me. Can't anyone hear me? I need help." The voice sounded desperate. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. It had a strange quality that I couldn't quite place. I fought the urge to answer, not knowing if I would be fired for dereliction of duty or not. This what I was out here for. I needed to answer, but my mind just wouldn't let go of those rules. The minutes ticked by like hours. 3 more times the radio sounded out its plea, each time sounding more desperate. I watched the time, counting the seconds until 3. When the time finally came, I picked up the radio. "Whoever was calling for help, please state your position so I can relay help to you," I said. "Who is this?" came the answer on the radio. "This is a park ranger manning a fire tower." "Well, park ranger, I've been on this channel all night and yours is the first voice I've heard." That's not possible, I thought. I had several calls for help over the last hour, I said. Are you sure? Absolutely. I wrote down the time of each call. Then why didn't you answer them until now? I paused. What could I say? Because a weird list of rules told me not to. Ranger, I said hesitantly, extenuating circumstances. Extenuating circumstances, the voice repeated as though tasting them. And what circumstances would those be? Whoever this was, they weren't going to let it go. Am not at liberty to say. You mean like falling asleep and breaking the rules? The voice said, sounding deeper, raspier, and more menacing. I froze. I hadn't turned the lights on yet, leaving the room in eerie darkness that left me feeling very exposed. I slowly panned around, looking out the windows and remembering the earlier feeling of being watched. You can look all you want, but you won't see me, the voice said. It's after 3, I said, hoping the terror I felt wasn't evident in my voice. You have no power over me. The voice chuckled. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Normally you would be correct. However, you broke the rules. What if I didn't know about the rules? I said, grasping at straws. Nice try, but you knew that you should be safe after 3. Damn it, I thought. It picked up on that. So what do you want? I said, fearing the answer. We're hungry, the voice said. Only now it sounded like many voices speaking at once. Come down and let us feed. My legs turned to rubber as I stumbled over to the door and stepped out onto the deck. The moon was rising half full, casting light into the darkness. I looked down and saw over a dozen large animals surrounding the tower in a circle, and each one of them was looking up at me. I dove back inside and locked the door. I frantically searched for the flashlight. Once I found it, I picked up the phone to call the ranger's station. There was no dial tone. I hung up and tried again, but still nothing. I pulled out my cell phone, but there was no signal. I paused to clear my head. Okay, I thought, you're freaked out right now. But what's actually happened? A weirdo on the radio, some animals around the tower. This list is making you paranoid. Just then I looked outside, and there was light off in the distance that looked like an airplane. The problem was it was heading straight toward me. It was mesmerizing. I found myself staring into the rapidly approaching glow until I realized it was going to ram into the tower. I found the best cover I could on the opposite side of the room and surrounded myself with as much furniture as possible. Being that the furnishings were sparse, that meant I dragged the chair over in front of me. I covered my eyes and hoped for the best. I may or may not have mumbled one of those "I promise will be good if you get me out of this" prayers. The seconds tumbled into minutes. Nothing happened. I peeked over the edge of the counter, and the light was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and wondered why I hadn't heard any engine sound. I decided it was because I was too busy ducking for cover. Then it hit me. I grabbed the manual and pulled out the list of rules. There it was. Rule number 5. If you see a glowing object floating toward the tower, don't look at it. Cover your eyes and count to 50. When you open your eyes, it should be gone. If not, cover and count to 50 again. I read over the rules again and realized how many had come to pass. For a long moment, I thought that maybe it was an elaborate joke. Some of the rangers yanking the rookie's chain, but there was too much I couldn't explain. The radio transmissions, the glowing light, the animals surrounding the tower. Then I realized I had broken that rule too. I hadn't fired the flare gun as instructed. I dug through the cupboard where the emergency supplies were kept and found the gun. I grabbed 2 flares and stepped out onto the deck. As I questioned the intelligence of firing flares that could end up causing a forest fire when I was supposed to be trying to prevent them, I heard a strange sound. I held my breath and cocked my ear for a better listen. It wasn't just one sound, it was many. I glanced over the side of the rail toward the ground and saw the animals all growling and pawing at the ground, working themselves in a frenzy. I backed away and loaded the first flare, then pointed up and fired. It rose majestically, glowing blood red, until gravity slowed its ascent and pulled it back to Earth. I watched closely to make sure not only that it went out, but where it landed, just in case. I waited a minute and fired the second flare, watching where it landed as well. I stepped back inside and hid in the bathroom as instructed. I knew in my heart that I was safe from the animals as long as I didn't go down the steps. The radio sounded off, scaring me nearly half to death. "Fire Tower number 5, the voice said. "I've seen your flares. Am on my way. Are you physically injured?" "No, not at the moment," I said. "He'll explain when you get here." "Roger that. En route." I tried to calm my nerves by thinking about what job I would apply for next, and how unfortunate it was that this one didn't work out. I thought about what I was going to tell the ranger when he got here. I couldn't tell him the truth. But what else could I say? There were some animals at the bottom of the tower that scared me. I honestly considered calling him back and telling him not to come when I felt heavy footsteps on the bottom stairs of the fire tower. I must been daydreaming and let time slip by. I stepped out of the bathroom and went to the trapdoor. "Are you here already?" I said into the radio as I reached down to unlatch the trapdoor. That was fast. "What are you talking about?" came the clear answer over the radio. "And not there yet." I paused as I felt the footsteps come closer to the top. "Where are you?" I said quietly. "I can barely see the tower. Him probably a mile away." His words hit me like a sledgehammer. I looked down at the bolt I was about to unlatch and pulled my hand back very slowly. "Which direction are you coming from?" I said. "Southeast." I looked in that direction, and sure enough, I could see headlights approaching. The radio sounded again, but with a slightly different voice. "Tower, ignore that last transmission," it said. "Am already here. Let me in, please." I stared down at the trapdoor as though it wanted to bite me. "Tower, let me in," it said more insistently. I backed away as something began beating on the trapdoor with tremendous force. The boards shook with every impact. I stepped inside and locked the door, then barricaded it with my only loose piece of furniture, the chair. Tower 5, Tower 5. I don't know who that is talking to you, but it dissed me. Do not open that door. Repeat, do not open that door. I backed into the bathroom with the flare gun in hand and locked the door. The pounding on the trapdoor became louder. I knew it wouldn't take much more of a beating. The whole room shook with every impact. I closed my eyes and prayed in earnest this time. And then my salvation came in the form of the engine sound of a pickup truck. I knew the real ranger was here. I listened as it came closer and then stopped. There was an awful silence for a moment, and then gunfire. Over and over, multiple shots in rapid succession. Then there was a lull followed by more shots. The pounding on the trapdoor had stopped as soon as the truck pulled up. "The coast is clear, Ranger. "You can open the door now," came a voice over the radio. I put my hand on the knob, smiling to go out and greet my savior, and when I heard a weak transmission, "Tunt, not me," it rasped. A heartbeat later, the screaming began. It was a gut-wrenching scream of terrible suffering. I could hear it beneath me. All I could do was drop to the floor and curl up in a ball as the screaming went on and on. I closed my eyes and tried not to imagine that poor Ranger being ripped to shreds by God knows what. Soon the screams lessened in volume and intensity, as though they were moving away. I rocked back and forth, hugging my knees, until unconsciousness mercifully took me. I woke to strange voices calling my name. I opened my eyes, and I was surrounded by people in blue uniforms. I panicked and backed away from them as fast as I could until my back hit a wall. "Calm down," one of them said. "It's all right." I looked around the room like an animal that had been backed into a corner. I was ready to fight my way out. "Are you injured?" he said. My mind raced to remember where I was. I looked out the window, and it was morning. The sun was shining, and I could see blue clouds. Everything from last night came back to me in a rush. I looked around the room and saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Am not injured," I said to the EMT. "Can you tell us what happened here?" a ranger said from behind them. I looked over at the manual that contained the list of rules, and for a heartbeat considered telling him to read them. "No," was all I said instead. "Can I go home now?" The ranger glared at me. Wanting answers and not getting them is frustrating, I know. "Is he all right to drive?" the ranger asked the EMT. They gave me the once-over, BP, lungs, heart rate, and didn't find anything to be concerned about. "I'd say physically has fine," the EMT said. The ranger sighed. "Go ahead," he said, "but I'll want to talk to you tomorrow." I nodded and stood, gathered my things, and started toward the door. When I got to the open trap door, I hesitated, seeing it had been hacked open with an axe. I took a tentative first step, then another, surviving a night as I had only to fall down several flights of stairs would be quite ironic. As I made my way down, white-knuckling the railing the whole way down, I saw people busy at the bottom. They were picking up shell casings with gloves and putting them into plastic bags. I could see spots of blood here and there, but no bodies, either human or animal. I saw the trail of blood as it disappeared into the woods. I stood on the bottom step for a long time, wondering if I was allowed to step onto the ground. I took the step and bolted for my car. I started it up and drove out of there as fast as I could. Just as I turned onto the gravel road, a deer walked out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes and slid to a stop mere inches from hitting it. It didn't move, just stood there staring at me. As I looked more closely, I could see blood on its nose and mouth. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a shred of a ranger's patch impaled on one of its antlers. Its eyes bored into mine as I slammed into reverse, then drive, swerved around the deer, and broke every speed limit getting home. I called my boss and quit as soon as I got there. Then I packed and started looking for a job in the city. Maybe I can find a nice, quiet warehouse to guard, but if it has a set of strange rules, am walking out, no questions asked. Story 2. I'm a Yosemite Park ranger. Some hikers never leave Cathedral Lake. The job of Yosemite Park ranger isn't what most people imagine. A lot of people picture us as law enforcement types, handing out tickets and enforcing park rules, when really that's a very niche aspect of it. Mostly we're just here to assist you, handing out maps, not speeding tickets, and giving people directions to the best views or to ideal camping locations. We remind people about safety and weather conditions from day to day. But the main thing we do, and this is more vital than people realize, is that we're just here in case anyone gets lost or hurt. We deal with a lot of belligerent people who like to think the park is their personal playground, where they can do whatever they want. It's my job to remind them to follow the rules, to dispose of their trash properly, to pick up after their dog, and to clip its leash back on while walking the trails. Some people take this as a personal assault on their freedoms, when really I'm just looking out for the safety of other visitors, like cyclists and horseback riders who share the paths. Dogs can be unpredictable and can misbehave on trails, and we have to look out for everyone. Still, I don't often get a lot of positive feedback for enforcing the rules. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Trust me, I get it. Every once in a while something interesting happens to break up the boredom and monotony of the job. Last summer I was walking around at night, doing a patrol of the campgrounds, when I saw something rustling around in the bushes. A guy came crawling out, dressed in a furry dog costume. I asked him if he was okay, and he just barked happily, then crawled away in the opposite direction. Shortly afterwards, I saw him chasing another person who was dressed as a cat, a woman who went scampering away and hid beneath a camper van, laughing excitedly and making purring sounds, licking the dirt from her fur pants with a long tongue. She saw me watching and clawed the air in front of her face, hissing territorially. It's not how I would choose to spend my Friday nights, but am not one to judge. By far the most interesting thing which has ever happened to me at Yosemite occurred last summer, and it wasn't just interesting. It was utterly terrifying. Every night when I fall asleep I have nightmares about that day. Every time I close my eyes I picture those dark tunnels in the rock face. It all started when someone called in a report saying they were out on the Cathedral Lake Trail when their brother went missing. The pair had been out hiking, and they got separated somehow. At first we thought it was just a routine mishap. People go missing in Yosemite all the time. It's no big deal in most cases, since usually the missing parties are found quickly enough. Half the time alcohol is involved, and I have to remind people to pace themselves if they indulge while camping. But every once in a while those missing people don't turn up, and we have to dispatch much larger search parties. In this case I went out on my own at first, heading to where the man had called us from. I drove out on an ATV, since it was a 16-mile round trip. When I got there, the guy looked frantic. He ran over to me and started speaking way too fast to understand. I told him to slow down and just give me the facts. It's important to stay calm in these types of situations. The guy took a deep breath and let it out. Then he started talking again, a bit slower this time. We were walking on the trail. He was right beside me. Then I turned around to look at the lake, and when I looked back he was gone. Just fucking itchy to get a sense if the man had been drinking or doing drugs. It's not that I'm trying to assume the worst in people, but we have to think of these types of things. The simplest explanation is usually the right one, after all. And it was much easier to imagine the two brothers taking sips from a Mickey and one of them getting separated and lost then too. Imagine one of them being abducted by aliens or taken in a very selective rapture. Slow down for a second. Take some deep breaths. What's your name? Let's start with that. Greg, he said, his face turning a shade less purple as he began to inhale air with trembling breaths in and out. Okay, Greg. I took out my notepad, jotting this down, along with his last name, which he'll leave out for the sake of privacy. And what's your brother's name? Dave, he said. Sniffling, I saw he had been crying recently. Where was the last place you saw your brother? Let's retrace your steps. He started protesting, saying that wasn't going to help, but I convinced him we had to at least try. Greg led me back a little ways to where he'd seen his brother last. I walked back here already, and I looked all around here before calling you guys. I thought maybe he went off the trail, take a leak, and tripped. It has had something like that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws. But I think something, he hesitated. Something what? I probed. Do you think something took him? Like those stories you hear about. He sounded embarrassed, but I tried to get more out of him and asked him which stories he was talking about. You know, you hear stories about Yosemite and other national parks. I'm sure you've heard about 'em, even if you're not in on the conspiracy. Stories where people go missing like this, and it makes no sense. Someone turns their back for a second, and their son or their sister or whoever is just gone. Disappeared. Like Dave, I saw it on YouTube. I replied, not sure what corner of the internet this guy had been visiting. Well, that doesn't happen around here, I can assure you. Let's keep looking. I'm sure he'll turn up, but the longer we looked, the less we found. It really did seem like the man's brother had just vanished. I was about to call in for more support, maybe even a canine unit, when the man yelled from a little ways off the trail, saying he'd found something. Following the sound of his voice, I eventually came to find him at the base of the mountain, face to face with the granite wall. At first I didn't understand what he was doing there, but as I got closer, I saw there was actually a cave which was well hidden in the rock face. It blended in perfectly with the mountainside until you were almost nose to nose with the pale gray stone. Good job, I said, patting him on the shoulder. But then I looked at our surroundings, getting nervous. We were pretty far from the path, in the thick part of the forest which was overgrown and tangled with vines and shrubbery. Do you think he would have gone into this cave on his own? Greg looked around, as if checking to see if his brother had left a message for him. But there was nothing. I don't think so. It's not like him to just leave me on the trail alone either, especially not for this long. If this was a prank or something, he'd have come back by now. I can tell something's not right. Has your brother played pranks on you like this before? I asked. The man was in his 20s, and his brother was probably of a similar age. Young men occasionally got lost or injured trying to scare each other by pulling pranks or filming videos in the woods. It was rare, but it had happened before. Once or twice, he admitted. I didn't call you guys for a while because I thought he was messing with me. I wouldn't put it past him, but not for this long. I was getting annoyed. Mosquitoes were biting my neck, and I was sweating in the heat of the afternoon after marching through the foliage for hours. I imagined the guy hiding inside the cave trying to scare his younger brother. Maybe he had fallen asleep in his dark hiding place, or he was just pushing it too far. But either way, I was upset. If this was a prank, it had wasted most of my afternoon. It probably annoyed me even more because I had my own older brother who had played tricks on me more than once in our younger days, and this was bringing back memories. "All right, you can come out of there right now," I yelled, marching into the cave, thinking the young man would be hiding in the small alcove. I turned a corner and saw a dark tunnel leading deep into the darkest recesses of the granite. This made no sense as far as I knew. There was no tunnel in this location, especially not one of this size, but it had been well hidden, nearly invisible in the rock face. I wondered if anyone knew about it, and I wondered if it was safe. I didn't feel comfortable going any further. The dark space looked like it went on for a long, long way into the distance, and I was getting an eerie feeling standing there. It felt like I could almost hear voices whispering from all around me. The words were lost in the echoing cave, and I got a strong sensation that we weren't alone, like icy fingers walking slowly up my spine. The other man came in behind me, marveling at the cave for a second before continuing to press forward. "Come on," Greg said, forging ahead. He might be in trouble. He was anxious to keep going, not scared enough of this horrifying place, with whispering voices coming from the shadows, and his apparent lack of fear made me twice as scared. "I'm going back for help," I said, shuffling backwards. "It isn't safe. Nobody knows we're here." My training and my instincts were overwhelming my curiosity, but Greg seemed not to care about the dangers. The man continued going forward, disappearing into the darkness. A few seconds later he was gone, and there was no indication he had ever existed in the first place. "Greg," I called out into the black abyss. There was no response. He might as well have been a ghost. An overwhelming urge to follow him rushed over me, and I took a few steps forward, feeling hypnotized by that black tunnel leading on and on forever. But then I shook my head, slapping my face as I tried to wake myself up from whatever trance I was in, which was overruling my common sense. I turned around and left the cave, my legs shaking and my hands unsteady as I called for assistance. After meeting the search party back at the trail, we went through the woods again to find the cave hiding within the 10,000-foot-tall rock face of Cathedral Peak, but it was gone. I remembered having trouble finding it the first time and thinking it was well hidden among the pale gray surface of the mountainside. You had to be nearly face to face with the wall to see it, since it was so invisible among the crags and boulders. I tried to tell my supervisor and the other members of the search party, but they didn't believe me. They said there was no tunnel there. They looked for hours and found nothing. Helicopters swept the area, and more teams with more dogs, bloodhounds, and German shepherds, but nothing was turned up. There was no trace of anyone else having been out there except me. Dumbfounded for the rest of the week, and for the rest of the summer, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to that conversation I'd had with the man on the trail named Greg, the man who had lost his brother and then disappeared into a cave that didn't exist. More and more, I began to wonder what would have happened if I'd followed him. It took a full year for me to build up the courage to go back out to that exact spot again. It happened to be on the same date and around the same time of day. Only this time I wasn't on duty. It was my weekend off, so I had plenty of time to comb the area for clues. My backpack was full of provisions, and I had enough to last for a night or two in the woods, maybe longer if necessary. Somehow I knew I just had a feeling that if I went back on that day, at that time, it would be there. The cave that didn't exist. Cathedral Peak loomed above me, getting larger as I made my way through the forest, moving toward it. The gray clouds above were shrouding the sun in darkness, while the thickening canopy blocked any remaining light from overhead. A chill ran through me, causing me to shiver involuntarily as I laid eyes on the black hole in the rock face, so plain and clear to see now. Taking a step forward, I found myself standing right in front of it, and I reached up my hands to feel the outline of the entryway, as if to confirm it was real. It was. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to submerge, and went inside. The air was cold and damp, with a strange, coppery smell. My flashlight was on my belt, and I grabbed it, but then decided not to turn it on. I was getting a strange feeling, like I was in an unsafe place, and needed to stay silent and hidden. There was a sound coming from up ahead which I couldn't place. It was a slurping, chewing sound, like someone tearing meat from bones with their teeth. As I went deeper and deeper into the tunnel, the air became colder and so damp that I felt droplets of water running down my face and into my eyes. A trickle of light was filtering in somewhere as well, causing the cavern to faintly glow in places. The air seemed to shimmer and dance in front of my eyes as I went deeper and deeper, feeling entranced as I stumbled along in the shadows. Faintly I realized that there was something wrong with me, as if I had been drugged, but I no longer cared. In fact, I found the sensation to be quite pleasant. And then I was abruptly awoken from my daydream as I came round a corner and saw the horror unfolding within the guts of Cathedral Peak. I can't possibly explain what I saw down there, and the shadows obscured most of it, drenching the monstrous creature in darkness. But the impression I got was of something like an octopus or a squid, crossbred with an oversized plant or a fungus, sucking and slurping, chewing and crunching something between its teeth. After a few moments of inspection, I realized it was a person's face that was being eaten, as the details could just barely be seen in the dim light of the cave. The skin was being stripped from its cheeks, the eyelids ripped off, and the lips peeled back and slurped up like noodles. Tentacles like tangled vines were everywhere, slithering and sliding across the pale gray stone floor all round me. At first I thought it was mud beneath my feet, but as I came fully to my senses I realized it was blood mingling and mixing with the dust beneath my feet, creating a dark, toxic red slurry which sucked at my boot heels. The tentacle vine things were everywhere. I realized with numb shock my feet were actually stepping on some of them, and I was amazed the creature hadn't noticed me yet. But it was obviously caught up with whatever meal it was currently ingesting. Feeling very glad I hadn't turned on my flashlight, I began to back away very slowly, my boots crunching across the writhing tentacles. A sick knot in my stomach was rising up and threatening to make me puke, fear and revulsion twisting my gut. My mind was spinning and my thoughts were racing, understanding there was a very good chance I would never leave this place. I tried desperately not to step on any more of the squirming, writhing tentacles which moved and twisted on the floor of the cave, soaking and basking in the blood which had been spilled everywhere, like pigs rolling happily in the mud. There was no possible way there could be so much of it, I thought. No one person has this much blood. This is like a river. And then I saw the others. They were hanging suspended from the ceiling, from the walls, from everywhere, amidst the purple, spine tentacles. They breathed in and out, still being kept alive, but just barely. Dozens of them were strung up and down the length of the cave, their chests rising and falling with weak breaths, but none of them opening their eyes or speaking. It was like they were sleeping. After a few long moments of searching, I found him, Greg, the hiker from the trail, who was looking for his brother. He was hanging upside down from the wall just beside me, his eyes closed. Parts of him were missing, a piece of his cheek, part of his hand, but the wounds were slowly healing. The creature, whatever it was, kept its victims alive down there, I realized. It was ingesting them slowly, perhaps even using pieces of its other victims as nutrients to feed the ones who were dying of starvation, like an otherworldly pyramid scheme built of blood and human remains. Shaking that mental image away, I grabbed Greg's shoulder, hoping to wake him up quietly. His eyes shot open a second after I touched him, revealing only the whites, and he began to screech. And I don't mean screeching like he was screaming out of fear, pain, or anything like that. This was an inhuman alarm cry which signified to me immediately that there was no shred of humanity left in him. He was now a part of the hive mind of the creature and its tentacle army. As his head turned on a swivel, I saw smaller tentacles were wrapped around him, going into his brain and into his neck, invading his ears and eyes, and drilled into his spinal column. I screamed involuntarily, seeing these details, and heard the creature in the tunnel as it recognized my presence. It wasn't fast, whatever it was, but it was huge. The cave shook around me, dust and pebbles falling from the stone ceiling above as I backed away from the hiker. Beneath my feet the vines were suddenly moving quickly, sliding around so that I couldn't find my balance. As soon as my shoes found purchase on the stone floor beneath me, I began to run. The tunnel was alive all around me now, the whipping vines twisting and bending toward me, reaching out like greedy hands, trying to grab me as I raced past. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the amorphous creature's central girth was finding its way through the cave and was moving my way a lot faster than I would have thought possible. But then again, I wouldn't have thought any of this was possible before living it. The light of the entryway was just up ahead, and I could smell the fresh air and could see the sun. Then my feet suddenly slipped as if someone had pulled the rug out from under me, and I went crashing to the ground face first. My jaw closed hard and bit the end of my tongue, causing it to bleed, the taste of copper filling my mouth a second later. I tried to get to my feet. The mental image of those poor, trapped people could be seen clearly in my mind's eye. In retrospect, I think the creature, whatever it was, needed us to be unsuspecting. If we were aware of what it was doing, its hypnosis wouldn't work. Maybe it was a chemical it released which caused people to want to explore the cave, a pheromone like insects use to communicate. But it didn't work as well if you knew about it, and if you understood its purpose. It released some more of that pheromone or whatever chemical it was using to lure people in, and I actually felt my legs grow a bit heavier. My eyelids, too. It was like I had suddenly just worked 3 night shifts and really needed to sleep. But then the wave of hypnosis passed, and I felt the rumbling of the ground beneath me, and that broke me from the trance again, causing me to scramble to my feet from the cave floor and run. As I neared the cave entrance and sprinted toward it, leaving my backpack far behind in an effort to lighten the load, I saw the rocks were actually closing in, tightening the gap. The entryway was shrinking somehow. It was the vines. I realized they were what was camouflaging the entrance, their color changing to match the pale gray stone. I picked up my pace, the twisting forms beneath me making it even more difficult. I didn't dare risk a glance over my shoulder, feeling the rumbling of the floor, and knowing that the bulk of the creature was just behind me, closing in, with the gap of the exit narrowing even further, shrinking to the size of a dartboard. I dove headfirst into it, imagining my face slamming into a sheer rock wall as it suddenly turned to stone right in front of me, sealing me in this dark labyrinth of suffering forever with the rest of these tortured souls. My eyes were squinted tightly shut as I felt the vines pulling and tearing at me as I went through the gap. For an instant they squeezed in around my midsection, threatening to stop me like Winnie the Pooh after an unfortunate attempt at pilfering honey when I popped out of the hole, and it sealed up behind me in an instant. I heard a loud crash as the creature flew headlong into its own obstruction. The trap it had created for me to keep me there had hindered its escape, preventing it from chasing after me. I could hear it thrashing and clawing at the vines, desperate for more flesh to sustain itself. Whatever it was growing too large even for its own control. Left alone to feed in the heart of the mountain, it would eventually destroy itself. It would consume its own flesh to sate its monstrous hunger, like a snake eating its own tail. I had a very strong suspicion that it was true. With that very specific idea in mind, I wandered back to my car. It was easier now without the backpack and all the gear. But the walk back to the cave would be harder. There would be lots to carry next time. After a trip to the hardware store, I went back out to the trail. It was night time now, and the place was abandoned. I borrowed one of the Ranger ATVs and took my supplies out to the spot where the cave had been. After bringing a few buckets of water from the lake, I began my work. Since I had marked the cave, it was easy to find it again, and to begin laying down the fast-drying cement. As park rangers, our job is usually to stop people from vandalizing mountains in this way, but I got the feeling Mother Nature would forgive me. It was my job to protect this place and the people who visited, and nothing could protect people from this thing. It was best to seal it away forever and let it slowly consume itself. Without a fresh supply of hikers, it would eventually run out of calories. It would eventually expire. It was only a matter of time. The vine tentacles squirmed beneath the layer of cement, groggily reaching out for me, trying to pull me in. I grabbed the trowel and slopped on another thick coating and watched as it rapidly began to dry, and the tentacles began to smooth out and settle down again, falling back asleep. That inhuman shriek could be heard from inside again, much louder this time, as if all of the hikers who the creature had abducted had all woken up at the same instant, and for just a second realized their predicament. Story 3. I used to be a park ranger, and even I don't believe the horror I found in the woods. Am posting this as a warning. There are things out there that you don't want to know about. Stay away from them. Don't go looking for them. I'll tell you my story in hopes that it will quench your curiosity. It was a night like any other night. At least lately. I had barely arrived at the ranger station, and there were already for calls of vacationers' homes getting broken into. Out here in the West Virginia Wildlife Preserve, people tend to think that just because they plant some houses, that the animal should somehow know and respect boundaries. That's kinda tough when the animals are on a huge plot of land where they've never been hunted and never even been threatened by anything other than a bigger animal. Folks seem to think this is a great vacation spot for them. What they don't realize is it's also a great vacation spot for the animals. I hopped in the company truck and started toward my first destination of the night. An elderly couple had been terrorized by a deer that literally broke in through a sliding glass door. They managed to trap it in a side room and needed someone to go release it. I got elected. When I got there, the vacationers looked like the ones caught in headlights. They were still wide-eyed. I could tell they were in shock. I had them go into another room and close the door. Once they were out of the way, I found the closest door to the outside and opened it. Then I went to the room with the deer in it. I slowly opened the door and was shocked to find the room covered in blood. The deer was laying on the floor, panting. I approached it, slowly circling around to leave the doorway open, hoping to give it an escape route. The closer I got, the more I realized this deer wasn't going anywhere. Its side was covered with claw marks. At first I thought a coyote had attacked it, but the marks were too far apart. They were large enough to be caused by a bear, but the individual claws were too far apart. I'd never seen anything like this. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say Freddy Krueger sliced it up. The deer's eyes went wide when I approached it, but it did jump up and run. I took this as a bad sign. Its breath came in ragged gasps as I struggled to roll it over. Once I did, it was my turn to struggle breathing. Its entire side was torn to shreds, but that wasn't the worst part. There were large chunks that were missing. I examined the wounds and found bite marks where the missing flesh should have been, but the bites were massive. If it wouldn't have challenged the laws of nature as well as my own sanity, I would have said it was bitten by a shark. Blood poured out of the side, and the deer struggled to draw breath. I stood and left the room, leaving the poor creature the dignity of a private death. When I went back and it was still, I took pictures with my cell phone and tried my best to carry the creature out without making more of a mess. After I got it loaded on the back of my truck, I went back inside and talked to the vacationers. When I opened the door to the room they were in, the woman's eyes grew wide and she started screaming. The man's eyes were the size of saucers as well. I approached them slowly with my arms outstretched to try to calm them down. It seemed to have the opposite effect. They started climbing the furniture and clawing at the walls to get away from me. I decided to back away and give them some room. "What's wrong?" I said. The man pointed a shaky finger at me. You're covered in blood," he said. "The deer got you," the woman said. "You've got rabies, or worse," the man said, keeping his distance. "I'm sorry, folks," I said. "This is the deer's blood. You killed it just for breaking in," the woman said. "What? No, it was already injured. I just took it to my truck." The couple seemed to settle down and consider this. "So you don't have rabies," the man said, slowly looking me up and down. "Or anything else," the woman said, hiding behind her husband. "No, Mom, I'm fine." She took her turn eyeing me up and down. I assumed looking for wounds, being satisfied. They asked the one question I didn't want to answer. "So what killed the deer?" the man said. "I really don't know," I said truthfully. Having just gotten them calmed down, I didn't want to send them back into a panic. "It was probably just a coyote," I said. "A coyote," the man said, diving back into the pool of panic. Or a bear, I said, trying and failing to calm them. A bear, the woman said, diving in after her husband. You know, folks, you've had a traumatic night, I said. I can't tell you what to do, but if I were you, We're leaving, the woman said, dragging her husband out of the room. That sounds like a good idea, I said, and then like an idiot I added, I hope you enjoy your stay. They either didn't hear me or ignored me. Either way, it wasn't long until I heard a car start then roll away from the house. I went back into the room where the deer had been trapped and started working backwards from there, trying to find out what had happened. It wasn't hard to pick up the trail. It had been bleeding badly. Seeing the bites and claw marks made that fairly obvious. I tracked back through the kitchen and out the smashed glass door. Once outside, I turned on my flashlight. The trail was a little harder to follow, but not much. I could still see drops of blood beside its tracks as I followed them back toward the pond behind the house. I approached the pond and saw signs of a struggle. This must have been where the deer was attacked. There were other tracks in with the deers, but they didn't make sense to me. They were large, too large. Their shape was odd as well. If I had to call them anything, I would have called them duck prints, but massive, larger than any duck by many times. A giant duck with sharp teeth. I think I'll leave that out of my report, I thought. It suddenly struck me what the tracks were. It was a man with swim fins on his feet. But why? Why go to all that trouble to poach a deer when you can just knock it out with a tranquilizer gun? My mind sent me an answer, but I didn't like it. What if the man is a psychopath, just getting his kicks by killing an animal with his bare hands? I thought about the mental hospital in the neighboring county, and wondered if one of their patients had taken an unsanctioned leave of absence, and they were trying to keep it quiet. I didn't like that thought one bit, aside from the fact that it didn't explain the huge bites on the deer. It also meant we had someone who might suddenly get a taste for killing. Doing this to animals was horrible. But what if he decided to go after something bigger? I shot a look at the house, wondering how many vacationers were within a short walk from this spot, and how many were armed. As I contemplated the safety of the people in the area, I heard something behind me. I whipped around and shone my light, but saw nothing. I scanned the pond and saw a ripple emanating from the middle, probably just a fish jumping. I took some more pictures of the struggle area with my phone, then started back toward my truck. I had more calls to answer, and this riddle would have to wait. I drove halfway around the lake, around 3 miles, to the other vacation home where a break-in had been reported. When the woman in her 30s answered the door, she took a step back. "Oh my," she said, looking at the dried blood all over my uniform. "Good evening, Mom. Sorry about my appearance," I said. "Did you report a break-in?" "Yes, we did. Please come in," she said in a friendly tone, yet gave me a wide berth, all closing the door. She led me upstairs to the kitchen. For some reason I was expecting to find blood all over like with the last house. However, this was a completely different mess. She showed me the door. It had been forced open, but not shattered like the last one. There was only a small amount of glass broken. Then the door latch had been unlocked and the door slid open. There were faint images of my giant duck tracks like the last house. My spine turned to ice. This house was over 3 miles away from the other. There were many more people in that space that might fallen victim to this crazed person. The woman showed me the rest of the kitchen and the mess that had been left. There were a few cans of sardines that had been opened and eaten, and also some cans of tuna fish. The strange thing was how they were opened. The cans had been torn into with something sharp, but not a can opener. The marks looked like they were torn open with claws. I shuddered to imagine the amount of strength it took to do something like that. And then I spotted it. Beside one of the cans of tuna was a small puddle of blood. "Mum, could I trouble you for a sandwich bag?" I said. She handed me one, and I carefully tried to scrape as much blood into it as possible. I sealed it and put it in my pocket, then went out through the broken door. Behind the house, just like with most of these vacation houses, there was a pond. I traced the tracks back to it, and they disappeared at the water line. I shone my light over the water, but the only thing I saw was a stray turtle. I stared at it for a long time as though it would somehow give me a clue as to what was going on. "What should we do?" the woman said, nearly scaring me half to death. I hadn't heard her follow me out the door and into the yard. "I'll send someone around to look at that door in the morning," I said. "In the meantime, it might not be a bad idea to sleep in a room that has a lock on the door. I'm sure they won't be back, but just in case." She did seem very comforted by that idea, but thanked me as I left. The next reports were just teenagers breaking in and stealing beer. That was it. No bloody wildlife, no weird tracks, just kids being kids. I went back to the station, changed out of my bloody uniform, and spent the rest of the night filling out reports on what had happened. When my shift was over and I passed on what had happened, I took a little trip to the neighboring county. I stopped in at the mental hospital and asked if they had any escapes lately. The nurse looked at me like I had asked her if she was wearing deodorant. "We don't have escapes," she said with obvious pride that showed as arrogance. I thanked her and left, feeling less than satisfied with her answer. Next, I stopped in at the local police department and asked one of my friends on the force if they could analyze the blood sample for me. I shared my thoughts that there might be an escapee from the mental hospital, and the blood sample might help us find out who and track him down. It was well past noon until I got to bed. That night when I got to work, it was pandemonium. There had been more break-ins, and people were starting to panic. The owner of the resort was frantic. People were canceling left and right and wanting their money back. When I walked in, he stormed his pudgy face right up into mine. "You told people to go home," he fumed, glaring up at me. "I merely suggested, do you want to pay their rental out of your salary? I work for the state, not you," I said. He turned a deeper shade of red. "Would you rather see people in body bags instead of animals?" I said. "That wouldn't do much for business, now would it?" He turned fire engine red and stormed out, mumbling, "Well, see, I investigated 5 break-ins that night. Only 2 of them were legit. The rest seemed like half-hearted attempts to stage a break-in so they could get out of paying for their rental." The 2 real ones shared the same characteristics as before, just enough of a broken window to open the door, the cans of whatever seafood was available. They even got shrimp out of the freezer. Everything about the way the intruder acted pointed to a person. All I needed to know was who. Again, I followed the tracks back to the nearby pond. I stood for a long time studying the surface of the water. I knew these ponds were all designed the same, a roughly 40-yard by 40-yard body of water around 5 feet deep in the middle, stocked with mostly bluegill for catch and release fishing. Anyone using these ponds to hide would have to be holding their breath for inhuman periods of time. I stared at the surface for 20 minutes. If someone was out there, they had an invisible snorkel or an extra set of lungs. I hovered at the level of the surface, dipping my mask underwater to get a glimpse of whatever there was to see. There wasn't much fish, underwater plants, and lots of water, just what you would expect from a pond. As I kept going towards the middle, the water was getting deeper. I now couldn't touch the bottom. I had to float on the surface. Looming in front of me was a dark spot on the bottom of the pond. I took it for a rock, but swam close enough to investigate anyway, and for a penny and for a pound. As I drew close enough to hover over it, I realized it wasn't a rock. I took a deep breath and dove to find out what it was. The further I swam down, the further I was able to swim down. I kept going and going. Light disappeared. I was sure I had been swimming straight down for a solid minute without touching the bottom. I turned and looked up. The surface of the pond was only a pinprick of light. My lungs screamed at me to turn around. I had no choice but to comply. I clawed at the water in desperation. It seemed like I was swimming in mud or something was pulling me down, almost like a force or current pushing against me, wanting me to drown before I could fully explore this hidden secret. After what felt like an eternity, I broke the surface of the water and gasped for air. I swam over to the shallows and walked out of the pond. I collapsed on the shore and lay there for a long time trying to regain my breath. As my brain received oxygen, I thought about what had happened and if it had been real, an illusion, or if I had just gotten turned around somehow and stuck at the bottom. I had to find out. I wasted no time driving to counties over and renting some dive equipment, along with a light. So armed, I returned to the pond and walked toward the middle again. This time, when I dove toward the dark spot, I was able to see exactly what it was. I used the flashlight to examine the darkness. As I swam deeper, the sides closed in on me, as if I was swimming down the gullet of some massive fish. I've never been claustrophobic before, but that was rapidly changing. I barely had any room to maneuver as the sides closed in. I contemplated turning around, but there was no room. I could feel myself start to panic. I had to focus to keep my breaths regular. I was very close to a panic attack when suddenly the tunnel opened up again. The sides grew further apart. I checked my watch, and I had been under for 15 minutes. The sides of the tunnel had spread out so far they were barely visible, and I could see a light ahead of me. I swam toward it, desperate to get out of this water. I broke through the surface and looked around. I was in the pond. Somehow I had gotten turned around and was back in the pond. I swam to the side until I could stand and walked out to the shore. Looking around, I made a startling discovery. I was in a pond, the same one as the break-in last night. Somehow there was a hidden tunnel between the two ponds. That's how the robber never gets caught. He just swims to the next pond slick as snot. No fuss, no muss. They told me they had a few regulars that came in every weekend, but no one knew, and no one who needed refilled more than once a week. I tried to sleep through the afternoon, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. It was working on the impossible puzzle of how the robber was getting air. I borrowed a couple trail cams and set one up at each pond. I needed to see if he had some new tank system or what. I also wanted to identify him and shut him down fast. I made sure to stay away from those ponds that night so he would feel free to do his thing. In the morning I gathered the cameras and took them home. I downloaded both memory cards before watching the video. Just as the second download was finished, my phone rang. "Hello," I said. "Hey, John, it's Steve. I got the results from that blood you gave me the other day." "Great," I said, hitting the play button on my computer. "Were you able to get a match on any hospital records?" "Not exactly. Why not?" I asked as a ghostly green image appeared on my computer. The image was blurred, but it was definitely the size of a man walking upright toward the camera. I clicked to the next slide and froze at what I saw. "Well, the thing is, the blood you gave me came back as reptile DNA. I registered the words he said in my mind, just like I registered the image on my computer screen, but I just couldn't place them in reality." "Are you there?" he said into the phone. "Yes, I'm sorry," I said. "Could you send a copy of your findings to my office?" "Sure, no problem. Thanks, I appreciate it. You really helped me figure this out." "Any time," he said cheerfully before hanging up. I hadn't taken my eyes off the computer screen the whole time. No matter how long I stared at it, I couldn't make my mind acknowledge it as real. It was a full-on nightmare staring me in the face. As I was going through my investigation, the owner of the timeshares walked in. "What are we all looking at?" he said, eyeing me with contempt. "It seems like John has solved the case of the break-ins," one of the other rangers said. The owner approached. He picked up the lab report and read it, then stared for a long time at the picture. "Do you know what this is?" he said absently. "I really don't know yet," I said. "I've never seen anything like it." He turned to me and smiled. "This is money," he said, holding up the picture. "What do you mean?" I said. "Those idiots that go around hunting. What do they call them?" "Cryptids." "Yeah, cryptids. They'll pay through the nose if they think they can find something like this. And then there's the TV shows and merchandising," he said. "You may have saved my financial height." He beamed at me. "I don't think you understand," I said. "This is a dangerous animal. If you had seen what it did to that deer. So what do you want to do? Hunt it down and kill it?" "Maybe not kill it, but definitely tranquilize it and take it to a secure location where it can't hurt anyone." "You dumb son of a bitch," he yelled. "I could make a mint. I wouldn't even have to repair those houses. They would all rush in to investigate and leave piles of cash in my bank account. But what about the people?" "Who cares about the people?" he said. "Throw them all out. I've got the chance of a lifetime beating down my front door, and you want to flush it down the toilet because you're scared someone might break a nail." He was breathing hard and staring up into my face. The air was charged with fury, his and mine, and then a sudden calm came over him. "Charles," he said, addressing the lead ranger, "isn't this a wildlife preserve?" "Yes, it is," Charles said warily. "And aren't the wildlife on this preserve protected from all tampering by law?" "Well, I guess so," Charles said. "What if those animals present a threat?" I said to Charles. "How many deer were killed by coyotes on this preserve last year?" The owner said. "Dozens," Charles said. "Were the coyotes removed from the preserve?" "No," Charles said. The owner turned and shot me a triumphant look. "John," Charles said, "I know you have everyone's best interests in mind, but you're gonna have to let this go." I glared at him. "And what happens when this thing decides it likes to eat humans?" All the eyes in the room that had been on me suddenly found somewhere else to look, all but the owner. He was smiling from ear to ear. I think the pudgy little bastard was about to break into the happy dance. I searched the room for any support, but found none. I pulled my badge off my shirt, quietly laid it on the desk, and left. If that was the end of my story, I would say I had failed. I took my pension and rented one of the houses on the preserve. The owner had leaked through social media that a cryptid had been spotted on the preserve. As he had guessed, the cryptid hunters and TV crews came in droves, renting everything in sight. My goal was different. I already knew it existed. I knew how it got around without being detected. Each night after, I laid out a fish, and the creature became less cautious. It was being fed, and the media frenzy was starving. The hunters had found nothing. There were no sightings as long as I fed it. Everyone had their cameras set up. After a week with no sightings, people started leaving. In desperation, he did the wrong thing. He hired an actor to dress in a creature suit and roam around. Of course, the hunters and shows saw right through this and destroy what was left of his reputation. I had rented the house for 2 weeks. Between the rent and the fish, my money was running out. I had kept the people safe. But what would happen when I stopped feeding it? I had managed to clear out most of the people so they would be safe. But what about my fellow rangers? What would happen when it became desperate? When the starving creature no longer had houses full of food to break into? I had 3 more nights until I had to leave. I was out of money. The preserve had become a ghost town. As far as I knew, I was the only renter left. It was decision time. I sat staring at the large tuna on the table with a bottle of bleach next to it. Let it live and see what happens, or kill it. I thought about this for a long time. Both options had merits and consequences. I chose a third option, a much more dangerous one. I took the fish out and laid it where I usually did, then backed up a few feet and stood there. Over an hour passed before the water stirred. I saw the head and eyes of the creature appear as it headed toward the fish, and then it stopped. It had seen me. I made sure to keep still with my arms at my side. It slowly approached and stood. It was a few feet away with the fish in between us. It studied me and sniffed the air, then became agitated. Perhaps it had smelled my scent before as a pursuer. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and collapsed to the ground, shaking. Once I had recovered, I went back inside and fell into a fitful sleep. That was only part of my plan. The next night would decide who lived and who died. I did exactly like the night before, minus the fish. The creature approached, stepped up to me, and looked around for the fish. I showed it my empty hands. It sniffed at them and growled, having smelled the scent of fish. It looked at my hands, and I wondered if it was going to bite them off as a substitute. It hissed at me and sniffed my face. I saw it flexing its claws the whole time. I stared into its face, those massive razor-sharp teeth, and swallowed hard. I did all I could to stay still, to show it I wasn't a threat. My heart hammered in my chest. It opened its jaws and showed me those horrible teeth. Its breath was a horrid stench I had never smelled, and hoped to never again. I closed my eyes, not knowing if they would ever open. Seconds fell into minutes. I opened my eyes, and I was alone. There wasn't even a ripple in the water. I sighed. My decision had been made. It had shown restraint, and I would, too. I went back inside, packed, and left. I could only hope and pray that the people that remained, including my former co-workers, would be safe. I went home and slept restlessly. In the morning there was a report in the newspaper on a break-in at the wildlife preserve. They said the only thing that was taken were cans of tuna fish. I smiled ruefully and wondered how long it would stay that way. If you're reading this, don't go looking for this thing. If you see it, don't tell others about it. Just leave it alone and hope for the best. Story 4. I was a park ranger in a fire watch tower, but I was the one being watched. When I was in my 20s, I took a job as a park ranger at a state park. It was the perfect job for me at the time. I love working outdoors. Every day presented new challenges, and I got to work alone. On days when I could get my work done early, I would find a beautiful spot somewhere in the park and read or listen to music. It was therapeutic. I had just gone through a tough year. School kicked my ass, and I had just broken up with my long-term girlfriend. I needed an escape, and the park provided it. While working during the day was amazing, the night shift at the park wasn't as relaxing. Do you know how uncomfortable the night can make even the most comfortable spaces in your house feel? Well, the pitch black of Mother Nature is like that feeling on steroids. The absolute worst place to sit during a night shift was the North End Watchtower. Everyone who worked there called it the Sentinel because it was massive and looked out across the whole of the forest that made up the park. It was tall, just over 100 feet above the ground, and made of old pine that seemed to retain the scent as if it had just been cut the day before. It was basically like a little cabin on top of really tall stilts. However, the inside wasn't exactly like a luxury box. The wall that faced the forest was one large window that gave pretty breathtaking views, but was also really good at giving you feelings of vertigo inside. There was relatively meager furniture. There were just 2 chairs, one for sitting in good weather and one insulated one for bad weather, an old desk, a single bare light bulb overhead, and a small fan to help keep you cool. I always brought something to read or write because the night watch in the tower is dull as hell. It was quite a hike, too. It took about 10 minutes or so to walk the 10 stories. When you had to do it in the dark at night, it tended to take a little longer. Each story you climbed disappeared into the darkness below you. It could be a bit unsettling. Once you're on top of the tower, your job for that shift is to basically look for fires or anything else out of the ordinary. When there was a full moon, you could see so much of the woods, but when there was a new moon or cloudy, you couldn't see a goddamn thing. If it wasn't for the bare light bulb in the cabin, you couldn't see anything. Typically, you keep in touch with people on the walkie and just idle away the hours. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I never dozed off for a while, but if you had come to visit me some nights, I might have had sleep creases on my face. Most nights, when I was in the Sentinel, I brought a book and read or a journal to write in. Basically, occupy my mind for the shift and ignore the dark. Rangers, especially older ones, love to tell stories about the weird shit they've seen over the years. People tend to think of parks as safe zones, where the most deadly thing that can happen is an animal attack. And yes, while animal attacks do occur, most of the violence comes from people, campers, drunk, will get into fights or fall into fire pits or get lost on their way to the bathroom. Drifters will sneak into the park and stay in unoccupied cabins or buildings. I cannot tell you the number of times I've walked into squatters chilling in a distant ranger cabin and have had to evict them. But one thing no one outside the world of park rangers likes to talk about is that parks, especially at night, tend to be a haven for criminals. I know it sounds crazy at the outset, but it happens. Murders, rapes, drug activity, you name it. It happens. I was lucky to never deal with any of the more heavy stuff a few times. We found drugs to be sold or a small patch of marijuana growing in the woods, but nothing horrifying. But if you've put your time in at a park, eventually you'll run across something that will haunt your dreams. Not too far from where our park was, there was a correctional facility. It wasn't Alcatraz or anything that high security, but the people there were serious criminals. It was a distance away on clear nights. You could barely make out the lights from the yard along the horizon, but it loomed large in your imagination. Your rational brain knew that any criminal could have to brave the dangerous forest in pitch black before they ran into you. But a tiny flicker of light kept a corner of your brain illuminated. It could happen. It won't, but it could. It was near the end of summer, and some of the staff had already split for the year. I was on for a few more weeks, but I was going to get night duty for most of those days since I was lowest on the totem pole. Worse, I would be on sentinel duty those nights. I know having the least amount of seniority was the main reason, but I know that my boss and a few older rangers play poker those nights as well. Since I had no money or skills, I was sent up into the tower. As the sun was starting to set, I walked into the central station at the park entrance. A few rangers were milling about, shooting the shit. The day shift was relaying night shift things they should be aware of, that kind of stuff. It mainly was nothing, not a ton of campers in the park this time of year, just a few sightings of bears nearby. Someone also swears they saw a bobcat but wasn't sure. But then someone walked into the station, and the tenor of the night shifted. "Excuse me," a woman about 40 said in an overly polite way. She was dressed in leggings, and my guess was she was here to walk the trails. My boss, and want to be Casanova Jonesy, noticed the outfit and lack of a wedding ring and shot her his 10-cent smile. "Welcome to ______ State Park. How can I help you today?" he said, his words dripping with saccharine. Hi," she said, a little taken aback. "I wanted to report something. Well, maybe report is a bit extreme, but just make you aware of something I saw out on the trails." "Sure. What did you see?" She shifted her weight. A little uneasy, it seemed. I clocked it and thought it was a little unusual. Sometimes when people see a bear or a bobcat, two things that had been spotted recently, they might have their adrenaline pumping and be a bit jittery, but this wasn't that. It sounds crazy, but, I think I saw something stalking me out in the woods. I'm sorry to hear that. Probably gave you a bit of a spook," Jonesy said. "We've had a few bear and bobcat sightings lately." "No," she said definitively, "it wasn't a bear or a cat. I think it was a person." "What trail?" "Sandalwood Loop B, I think it's called. That's not that far from a few campgrounds and fishing cabins." They didn't look like a camper. Everyone in the cabin had stopped talking and turned their attention to the woman. She noticed, and you could see the red rush to her cheeks. "What did they look like?" They looked shadowy," she said, "like they were afraid of the sun or something. And they were following you." I caught something in the corner of my eye around the last turn of the loop. I stopped and pretended to stretch, and I saw something in the woods just off the trail. They were hiding behind a tree, eyeballing me. Jesus, Jonesy said, I'm sorry that happened to you. Thank you, she said, her voice going soft. They followed me until I nearly got to the end of the loop. I started running then and lost sight of them. Jonesy turned back to two of the older rangers and told them to hop in a gator cart and check out the woods for anything. He told them to keep their walkies on and take a sidearm just in case. They left in a flash, and Jonesy turned his attention to the woman. Can you tell me anything that might help? Did they have any kind of identifiable clothes? Did they speak to you? Did they? She interrupted. They made noises. Noises? Jonesy asked, slightly confused. Yes, a few. They made a kind of a chittering noise and a faint, yelling kind of sound. Possibly cicadas, another older ranger said. A group of them can scare the fur off a cat. Maybe, I dunno. They also whistled, but not like they were whistling at me. It's like they were trying to blend in with nature. Can you describe the noise? She whistled something that I knew right away. That sounds like a wood thrush. How do you know that? Jonesy said, not being able to help himself. My grandpa was an avid birder. He turned his attention back to the woman. Did you want to file a police report or? No, she said quickly. I don't even have that much information. I just was scared and wanted to let you know just in case. Are you sure? Yes, she said. I don't think anyone else was on the trail after me, but I didn't feel right not telling you. I'm so sorry that happened. Do you hear? The park is supposed to be a place to relax. She laughed nervously. Jonesy shot her a calming smile. Here's my card, he said, handing her one. If you change your mind, please call me. She pocketed it and nodded. She turned to leave and then stopped. She turned back and, after a brief pause, said something else that was weird. I saw this thing on both sides of the trail. He crossed behind you. I didn't notice him doing that, but he must have because I saw him on both sides. Unless there was more than one of them, I said, instantly regretting it. Jonesy turned and gave me a Jesus dude look, and I clammed up. Do you need someone to escort you to your car, ma'am? No, I'm right out there. Thanks, though, she said as she walked out the door. We heard her motor away a few moments later. Sorry, I said before Jonesy could say anything. He sighed. No worries, just don't go freaking out guests. We need people like her to come back. People like her to come back, right? Was I too obvious? Jonesy said with a smile. What do you think she saw? I asked. A Wendigo, one of the other rangers said, and everyone laughed. Having read about Wendigos and skinwalkers, a mythology class, I didn't find it so amusing. Might have been her eyes playing tricks on her. If someone is out there, those two will find them. They're good at tracking, and whatever is out there couldn't have gotten too far. Great night to be up in the tower, I said with a smirk. That's probably the safest place to be. Jonesy said, no one climbs 10 stories if they don't have to. I hung around for about another half hour or so to see what came of the trackers. They came back and said there wasn't anything around the Sandalwood Loop, no footprints of anything they saw. Granted, the leaves had started to fall, so it was hard to see anything on the ground, but I trusted their tracking skills. Not going to lie, even with the guys coming back empty-handed, I was still a bit nervous about the shift. Jonesy was right, though no one climbs stairs unless they have to. This is still America. After all, laziness always wins. Also, there was nothing in the cabin above the trees except me, a book, and a journal. Nothing worth making the journey. As the sun slid behind the horizon, I started my trek to the Sentinel. When I got to the platform at the bottom, something caught my eye. The tower base is lousy, with stickers, tags, and names carved into the pine. Usually, it's Joe plus Jane for Eva, or something along those lines, but what had been freshly cut was a bit different. It was a pair of eyes. Had the earlier events not happened, I probably wouldn't have even noticed the eyes. I chalked it up to my mind, already being primed to see some spooky shit. I assumed it had been some kids earlier, or one of the older rangers looking to give me a scare. Whatever it was, I did a quick glance around me before I started up the stairs. From the vantage point high above the trees, you can see storms come rolling in. Tonight was no exception. It was a waning crescent moon tonight, so it would be a bit dark, but those rain clouds made it pitch black. The only natural light I would see would be the occasional burst of lightning inside the clouds. The wind had picked up, too. You can tell because there is a slight shift in the tower on the wind's gust. Not a lot, but just enough to notice. You get used to it, but when it first hits, it can be a bit jarring. There were a few wind gusts, but I settled in for the evening and stopped noticing. About an hour later, my walkie crackled to life. "How's the view?" It was Jonesy. "Great," I said. "We're about to do a pass round the park. Want to give you a heads up." I leaned forward in my chair and glanced through the window towards the base. I saw Jonesy and a few other rangers getting into their gator cars to head out. Their headlights were bright, but only because there was literally no other light down there. The beams themselves only saw a few feet in front of you. "Thanks. You guys need me to scout anything for you?" "No, we'll be fine, but hey, if you see any wendigos, let me know." "Huh. Funny," I said. "If you hear any thrushes singing, run. Those boys should all be in bed by now." "I'll keep that in mind. Be back in a half hour, 40 minutes tops." "Over and out," I said, and I placed down my walkie and watched those tiny heads drive off into the woods and out of sight. I kicked back in my chair and started reading again. That's when I heard a board creak. At first, my mind assumed it was probably just the wind pushing the tower. It can cause a creaking sound in the tower. But my brain pushed away the fog of rationality, and a more terrible thought became clear. What if someone was outside the door? I would have heard them walking up the stairs, right? I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, outside of smashing my walkie or flashlight into this potential person's head. There wasn't much. If I did need to escape, light and communication would probably be a good thing to have. Didn't want to go and break essential equipment. I grabbed my walkie and pressed the button. "Jonesy," I said, trying to sound confident. "Jonesy, you out there?" I knew there was a chance he might be out of range. Sometimes these walkies can be wonky in the forest, and I was praying he would respond. But the longer I heard the static, the less hope I had he could hear me. "Jonesy, just curious if you guys had circled back this way." "Finally, yeah. Ned forgot his light, and we came back, but we're heading out now." "Okay," I said. "Hey, question. But Did anyone come up to the sentinel by chance?" "Just you," he said, and then added, "Why?" Thought I heard a board creak. "It's breezy tonight, storm coming in. Probably just the wind or the Wendigo," he said, chuckling to himself. "Have fun," I said, ending the conversation. I put my walkie back down and stared at the door that leads to the stairs. The odds that someone would have walked up here to put a scare in me was remote. Like Jonesy said earlier, no one walks 10 stories unless they have to. But what if the woman from earlier had seen someone or a group, and they were looking for a place to hide out? Would the sentinel be a good choice? Maybe. I don't know how the criminal mind works. Regardless, for my own sanity, I would have to swing that door open and see if anything was there. It was probably nothing, but I needed to be sure. If not, the rest of my shift was going to be miserable. I quietly walked across the cabin to the door and grabbed the handle. I counted down from 3 in my head and swung the door open. There was nothing there. In the distance, a flash of lightning crashed and thunder rolled, but no person was standing there. I sighed and then stepped out onto the landing. You could really feel the breeze up here now. That storm was moving in quickly. You could smell the rain coming. The earthy scent that the raindrops stir up was all around me. Even though I was sure no one was outside the cabin, I wanted to check out the stairs just in case. I walked over to the stairs and stared down. In the darkness, the stories below me just merged with the night. I couldn't see anything. I pulled out my flashlight and shone the beam down the stairs to the next landing. The flashlights we had were decent, but not ideal. Cops got 1,000 lumen flashlights to shine in your eyes when they pull you over, and we were lucky to get half that. It's not like we need adequate lights working in the pitch black or anything. I walked down to the first landing and glanced around. Nothing seemed out of place. I flashed my light down to the next landing, and something caught my eye. The light reflected off of something on the stairs. Not unlike a toddler, I made my way to the shiny object. I was a little surprised to find a small piece of reflective strip on the stairs. I didn't remember seeing it on the way up. I would have picked it up to throw it away. It looked like it had been ripped off of a jacket or uniform or something. But how did this get here? The wind might have blown this up from a campsite, but that felt wrong. It was. I turned to climb back up to the cabin when I froze on the railing. Someone had carved another set of eyes. I didn't move. I stood there as my brain tried to piece together an excuse that made sense, but it was failing. Even when I started to feel the patter of rain on my face, I didn't move. What the hell was going on? Fearing that someone might be looking at me, I clicked off my flashlight. I know I said earlier that I didn't want to waste essential tools, but at this point I was ready to brain someone until the damn thing broke. The rain started to come down a bit harder, which helped to break me from my fugue state. I was about to start back up towards the cabin when I heard the floorboards above me squeak. There was a crash of thunder nearby, and it barely registered in my mind. I was so tuned into the symphony of pine stairs that a bomb could have blown off near me, and I'd miss it. After what felt like 17 hours, I hadn't heard anything else. I relaxed a little bit. It was probably nothing. My mind was overactive, and I was red-stringing together disparate events into a cohesive narrative to scare myself. I was sure that was it. Then I heard something drag across the pine above me. It sounded like someone was gouging out the wood. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like jello. I wanted to go streaming down the stairs, but I was afraid I would make too much noise. Plus, the idea of running down 8 stories of now wet steps didn't sound ideal. I slowly started making my way towards the stairs heading down when the gouging noises above me stopped. After a slight pause, I heard footsteps head towards the door of the cabin. Someone was up there. I was sure of it. What they wanted to do, well, he didn't want to think about that. I slowly started down the stairs, careful to not let any of them squeak underneath me. I kept my flashlight off and just descended into the darkness. I reached for where my walkie should be and cursed to myself when I realized I had left it up there. As if on cue, I heard the cabin door swing back open and heard an object crashing through the trees towards the ground. As it passed me, I heard the familiar static of the walkie. Whatever was in the cabin had just tossed my only lifeline to the outside world. Well, fuck, that wasn't good. I hastened my trip down the stairs. As I rounded the landing for the 6th story, I suddenly heard the familiar call of a wood thrush 3 landings below me. Only the thrushes were gone at this time of night. This was a person. He made the noise again, and it clicked as to why they would give their position up. He was signaling to the person above me. He was letting him know where I was, 1 above, 1 below. I was trapped. Above me, I heard someone start down the steps. They moved slow and steady. To liberate, whoever was up there was coming down to me, and I had nowhere to go. I thought about jumping down and trying to grab a branch on the way, but knew that would end poorly for me in the best of scenarios and deadly in the worst. They rounded the 2nd story down. I was running out of time for a plan. I could run down the stairs and try to bull rush whoever was down there. But the rain was coming down harder now, and we could slip and fall off the tower. The only thing I had going for me was the darkness. I had the only light, and outside of the occasional lightning flash, it was dark as hell. It would cloak me if I could find a spot to hide. As he rounded the landing above me, I made a decision that, looking back, was one of the wildest things I've ever done in my life. I wake up some nights gasping for breath because I dreamed about doing this. The instinct to survive is so deeply ingrained into our animal brain that I suppressed all the fear I would usually have and just acted. As quietly as I could, I climbed over the handrail on the landing and hung off the side of the stairs. My feet felt for the handrail on the landing below me to help steady me, but my toes just grazed against the wood. I couldn't reach them. My arms started burning as they held my weight. I clawed into the wood with my hands, hoping my nails digging into the pine would counteract my wet palms. I closed my eyes, partially to shut out the pain in my arms, and partly because I was afraid the whites of my eyes would get noticed. I heard the footsteps turn the corner and start to come down the stairs right next to me. I held my breath. My arms were burning, and I was so afraid I would lose my grip. The person took the steps one at a time, slow as possible. They were looking for me on the landing, but didn't see me suddenly. Whatever it was started chittering into the darkness. A few seconds later, the wood thrush called back. The footsteps stopped coming down the stairs and started going back up. No, in a flash, a solution came to me. I used my right foot to kick off my left boot. Suddenly, I was glad I didn't take Jonesy's advice to keep the laces as tight as a drum. I kicked my boot onto the landing below me, and they landed with a heavy crash. The footsteps stopped going up the stairs. I freed my other boot, and it crashed down next to their partner on the landing. It sounded like I was down there. The footsteps walked right past me, heading down quickly to surprise me on the landing below. As soon as they rounded the corner, I called upon all the strength in my body and quickly pulled myself back up over the railing. I landed with a thud which gave away the ghost. I popped up and dashed up the stairs to the top of the cabin. I knew they'd be right behind me, so I didn't hesitate. In seconds I was at the top of the stairs and outside the cabin door. I was met with another pair of eyes carved into the wood. They stared back at me, watching and waiting to see what I was going to do next. I dashed into the cabin. 10 leaned against the door to brace against anyone trying to burst in. I knew to people, at least I hoped, people were coming, and they were going to not stop until they got into the cabin. Another bolt of lightning flashed nearby, and the ensuing thunder shook the tower. Things were close. I glanced up and noticed that someone had carved another set of eyes staring at me just above the window. Only this time they left a message with a picture. You watch us, but who's watching you? I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swallowed hard as I heard 2 sets of footprints reach the top of the landing. Sure enough, they charged into the door, pushing it open slightly. I braced hard against the door and started yelling. Just the most primal screaming I've ever done. They kept thumping the door. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. Each thrust pushed the door open a bit more and a bit more. I was struggling to hold out against them. I was tired, and my socks were slipping on the wood. It was only a matter of time until they burst through. I thought about my life. I thought about my parents, my friends, all the things I'd never get to do. Then the hair on my arms started to stand on end, then my leg hair. Then my hair started to rise. Only it wasn't fear that was causing this. It was something much more primal, much more natural, much more powerful. I dashed across the room and sat on the insulated stool, a beat-up wooden seat with glass legs, and held my feet up. As the door burst open, I saw 2 sets of eyes staring at me. The 2 faces grinned, and the cabin light reflected off the blade of a knife. I screamed as everything went white, and what sounded like the sky splitting into erupted around us. Lightning had struck the tower. I was safe glass, and with our shitty conductors, but the 2 men who were standing in a puddle weren't as lucky. The blast had shocked them and sent them tumbling down the side of the tower. When I opened my eyes, I could see the burn marks across the pine and smell the fire that had been started. Without giving anything a second thought, I dashed out of the door, careful not to catch myself on fire, and ran down the stairs of the Sentinel. It may take 10 minutes to climb up, but it took me about 2 minutes to get down. As soon as I hit the bottom landing, I saw the lights of the gator carts pull up. I collapsed on the ground as Jonesy and the other rangers rushed over to me. I glanced up and saw his face, and I started to sob above him. The flames licked and ate away the tower floor by floor. It would burn for over an hour. I later learned that the 2 men killed by the lightning were escaped convicts from the jail. Both of them had beat up a guard, grabbed their clothes, and headed out into the woods 3 days earlier. The escape had been kept quiet because they didn't want to spook anyone and thought they'd track them down in the woods sooner rather than later. Why scare people if you didn't have to? Also, fuck that noise. They both had been convicted of murder, And I swear to God, this is what the police told me. The criminals had ill intent for me. I told the officers I had gathered that. Thinking back, they probably watched me climb up the tower later and saw an easy target. When I had first heard the floorboard squeak outside the door, the criminal that had followed me up made a quick decision to climb up onto the roof of the cabin to prevent me from seeing him until he was ready. I probably didn't hear anything on the roof because of the fan and the rain. I think about what he could have done to me had he caught me by surprise, jumping down from the roof and shutter. At best, I'd be stabbed by a madman. At worst, I tumbled 10 stories to my death either way. Not a great thing to linger on during idle hours. That was my last day as a ranger. I was due back to school in a few weeks, and I needed time to calm my nerves. Everyone understood. They even paid me out for the week, which was nice. I also took a small part of the Sentinel as a memento of the ordeal. Every time I look at the piece of what I took from the tower, I wasn't reminded of what could have happened to me, but instead of what I did to survive. Someone was watching me that night, but it wasn't just the criminals, it was nature herself. Story 5. I'm a park ranger, and something is stalking the local hikers. I'm a park ranger, but am leaving my name and the name of the park out of this post intentionally. The names of all those involved have been changed as well. I needed to get this story out there, but cannot rely on conventional avenues. That's why I'm posting it here. I could lose my job or much worse, but this story has to be told. I owe it to Catherine, not her real name. I arrived at the ranger station like any other day. I was given my section of the park to patrol. At the first campground, there was a man who couldn't get his camper started. A quick jump got him rolling along. Next was a couple needing directions, then an overturned canoe. I had only made it a few miles through the park. I was going to have to move if I hoped to make a full route today. I managed to grab a few quick bites of lunch and put some miles on without anyone needing help. When the call came over the radio, there was a hiker that found something and I needed to go check it out. A half hour later, I was talking to a middle-aged woman who had made a concerning discovery. She found a hat and a note on the trail. I read the note, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I'm writing this note and leaving it behind because I'm not sure what's happening. The 5 of us friends have been planning this trip forever, even since long before we graduated. But it always seemed like something came up at the last minute, and one or more of us couldn't go. For a while, I was almost convinced that some outside force was working against us, that we were cursed not to go camping together until we were all too old to enjoy it. I could picture Devin now. He would still go even if he was so old he had to use a walker on the trail. He's always up for camping. I think the guy carries a loaded backpack in his car with him everywhere he goes. Lowell, Adrienne, cut here right behind us, followed soon after by Dean, of course. Terry was the last one to show. We started up the trail in great spirits. 3 miles and the sun was just starting to heat up. We came to a spot with a large stone off to the side of the trail. Devin said it was the trailhead, but I didn't see any trail. He led us through some heavy brush, but on the other side it cleared out and we could see the faint impression of an overgrown trail. I went last and left my hat on the stone in case we got lost and needed to be rescued. I think that's exactly where we're heading, straight toward loss. I'll leave this note under my hat and hope that someone finds us. So I thanked the woman, placed the red hat back on the stone just in case, and headed into the heavy brush. Once through the initial overgrowth, the trail became visible. Old memories flashed through my head, ones I never wanted to think of again. I took a deep breath and headed down the trail. It was overgrown for the first mile or so, and then it opened up into a field. I could see people had walked through before me by the way the weeds were partially trampled. As I walked through, a deer jumped ahead of me, startling me. Until that moment, I didn't realize how jumpy I was. I tried to settle down and tell myself that these kids were just lost and I could catch up to them and get them out. Telling myself that didn't make the memories go away, I entered a clearing with a fallen log and another note with a rock sitting on it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I think him being silly. This trail is so bad. Maybe I was wrong. Devin seems to know where he's going. I just can't shake this feeling that we're being watched. Sometimes I look around and I swear I see a face disappear behind a tree. Am I being paranoid? Maybe if the birds would start singing again, that would lighten my mood. But I haven't heard a bird or any other animal for a while. I wonder why they're being so quiet. Are they afraid of us? On another note, Terry seems to be brooding more than usual. Maybe he forgot to bring enough of his stash to last the trip. Devin is in his glory since everyone has to rely on him for directions. Adrienne and Dean seem to be along for the ride, although I have noticed Dean looking around at the trees as well. Maybe you'll ask him if he sees anything. If you're trying to track us down, I hope we aren't being too much bother. I just have this feeling, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. My mind wandered back to the kid I couldn't save. It had been shortly after I started as a park ranger. An 11-year-old boy had gotten lost on this very trail. His parents searched frantically for him before calling us into Loke. I remember hoping to be the one to find him as we formed search parties and searched on in and around every inch of the trail. In the end, I got my wish. I found him, but I wish I hadn't. I pushed the memory to the back of my mind and focused on the trail. It was starting to fade. The trampling of feet wasn't making enough of a difference, and I was starting to lose my way. Out here that can be deadly. Just when I was about to give up and flip a coin, I saw a piece of paper in the weeds barely visible. I dug it out and read it. It seems like we have a dilemma, a fork in the road as it were. You would think I would be happy to see the doubt in Devin's eyes as he looked from one choice to the other, but you'd be wrong. It made my confidence plummet. It made me think that we were never getting out of here. Everyone's running out of water. Devin yelled at us for not conserving, but I saw him drank the last of his too. He ranted and raved at us for a while, but we all knew that he was just mad because he didn't know what to do. In the end, he flipped a coin. We all did our best not to laugh. Adrienne is reaching the end of her rope with Devin and his attitude. Dean has been playing peacemaker, trying to keep them from going at it too much. Terry was been way too quiet. I haven't seen him light up once. Something's up with him, but every time I ask he says it's nothing. The birds still aren't singing, and it's starting to really bother me. The strange feeling I have hasn't gone away. I asked Dean if he had seen anything strange, but he won't talk about it. We've been on this trail for a while. I'm hoping to come to the end soon. By the way, in case the note got moved or blown around, we took the left trail. I was panicked by the end of reading that note, and so relieved she mentioned which trail to take. I radioed in and reported that I was on the trail of the missing hikers. I mentioned the fork and taking the left side. I was told that there was no search party going on yet, that I was the only one looking for these kids. It was the complete opposite of years ago looking for that kid. Everyone was searching. I know we combed every inch of that wilderness. I met with the woman who showed me the hat and note in the afternoon. If they started out around daybreak, they could be a good 5 or 6 hours ahead of me. If the leader is so driven to continue, it's hard to say how far they might be. I believe I made up a lot of time with that single crossing. I jumped down to the water and drank my fill, then climbed back up feeling much better. It was tough to pick up the trail on the other side. I was glad to find a note sticking to a branch. Oh my gosh, Devin just about came unglued when we got to that tree over the river. He hopped up on it right away and started across, but the rest of us weren't so sure the trail led that way. We asked him how a trail could be planned with a fallen tree as part of it. He sputtered and stopped and told us how lost we'd be without him. Dean had finally had enough and told him we were lost because of him. I seriously thought Devin was going to take a swing at him until Terry of all people came to his side and told Devin to shut up. The rest of us all came together and told Devin he could keep leading us as long as he stopped, acting like a petty tyrant. He didn't take it well. Dean and I talked about the disappearing face we'd seen a while back, but neither of us had seen it again. At least the birds are back to singing. I chuckled, figuring that Devin would be a big baby over the whole thing, but after the chuckle came concern. Deposed leaders are usually dangerous. I wondered how much offense Devin had taken and if he would be looking to get some payback in some small or large way. Darkness was coming on fast in the woods. I had to make a decision. Camp for the night or keep going. If I camped, I could defend against the predators that lurked in the darkness. But if I kept moving, there was a good chance I could stumble across the group before daybreak. It wasn't much of a decision. These kids that I didn't even know, that I had plunged headfirst into the woods without even my backpack of supplies, of course. I was going to try to catch up with them. If I had done that years back, would that kid still be alive? Such thoughts nagged at me. Most days I kept them at bay, but here in this same forest, close to the spot where I found him, I needed to focus. If I'm going to keep after them, then I need to get going. I stepped off the trail to take a piss and heard a metallic snap. At the same time, I felt intense pain shoot up my leg. I looked down and I had stepped into a bear trap. I screamed, fell to the ground, and rocked back and forth in agony. After a few minutes, I focused on getting the trap off my leg. I found a branch and pried the trap open, screaming the entire time. I managed to pull the trap off my leg and threw it to the side. I really didn't want to take my boot off, but I had to see the damage. Of course, when I was at my weakest was when I heard footsteps in the trees close to me. I knew there was a predator around just because it could sense I was vulnerable. I leaned against a tree and held my crutch ready as a weapon. The footsteps came closer. They paused as if they knew I was ready, then slowly continued stalking me. They were deliberate but slow. Each step seemed measured, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. I heard it right next to the tree I was hiding behind. I whipped around as best I could and raised my crutch to strike. A deer stared at me for a heartbeat, and then turned and ran through the forest. I collapsed against the tree and slid down to the ground, allowing the adrenaline to bleed off. I don't remember falling asleep. I woke to sandpaper scraping the side of my face. I opened my eyes, and there was a bear beside me, licking my cheek. I freaked out, screamed, and rolled away from it. The bear wasn't ready for that reaction. It startled and ran away. I slowed my rapid breathing and looked around. It was dark. There were thin shafts of moonlight beaming through the trees, providing a little light. I checked my watch, and it was nearly 4 in the morning. I rose slowly and gingerly on my injured ankle, took the small flashlight out of my pocket, and prayed it still worked. My prayers were answered when the beam shone brightly through the woods. I panned around trying to get my bearings. After a moment I found the trail and started hobbling toward it. The nightly noises were a comfort. At least if the crickets were chirping and the rest of the forest was singing its nightly tune. That meant predators weren't around. I stumbled and fell, hitting my injured ankle against a rock. The pain overwhelmed me, and I screamed. After a few minutes of recovery, I got up and continued at a slower pace. Paying more attention to the ground, I chided myself for falling asleep and losing so much time. At least the trail was easy to follow. I continued on through the night, hoping I wasn't too late. I got so excited I nearly fell over my crutch looking around for signs of anything. The tent was a mixed blessing. I stumbled across a note sitting under a rock beside the smoldering fire. Before I sat, I held my hand out to the fire. It was still warm, but the embers were nearly dead. It had been hours since it was first lit. If I hadn't taken my unintentional nap, I would have caught up with them. There was nothing I could do but sit by the dying fire and read the note, hoping there was good news. We found this clearing and decided to camp. Everyone was tired from walking, and the mood was somber because no one seemed to know where we were. All of us had been hiking in this forest before, but none of us had ever seen or heard of this trail. We set up our tents and started a fire, then had some supper and sat around. No one really felt like talking, so I tried to get the ball rolling by asking Terry why he was late. He hesitated, but at my prompting, eventually, he told us that he had hit an animal with his car on the way here. I asked if it was a deer, and he said no, it was much too big to be a deer. He said it walked upright on 2 legs, and it was massive, like 8 feet tall, covered in brown hair. He swerved to miss it, but the strangest thing was it seemed to try to jump in front of him anyway, like it wanted him to stop. We all listened with rapt attention. Just then, off in the distance, we heard a scream. We all froze. Devin started spouting off and yelling at Terry for trying to scare us. Then he stormed off. Dean tried to stop him, but he pushed him away and disappeared in the woods. The rest of us talked, trying to decide if we should go look for him, but in the end, we figured we should just let him go and cool off. A short while later, we heard a rustling off in the distance and a muffled cry. We huddled a little closer together and went on high alert. Our eyes darted back and forth as we searched the impenetrable wall of trees surrounding us, looking for any sign of a predator. Right then the strangest thing happened. All the nightly noises stopped. The crickets, the squirrels, the owls, every sound that you usually hear in the forest at night simply ceased. It was unnerving. For a moment I wondered if I hadn't gone deaf. Our eyes darted all round in the darkness. We all huddled closer to the fire. Dean pulled out his hunting knife. None of us said a word. It was like if we spoke, something bad would happen. Somehow, whatever caused the noses to stop would find us if we spoke. Someone did speak, though, just not who we expected. "Why are you here?" came a raspy, deep voice that seemed to echo from everywhere. We looked all around, and finally a man stepped into the light. He was large, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, and older, maybe in his 50s or 60s. He was also wearing a park ranger's uniform. It looked old and shabby, like he had been wearing it for a long time. There were no pneumatic or park patches. At that point, we didn't care. We had been rescued. We clamored around him, saying how glad we were that he had found us. We told him about going on the trail and how we weren't sure where we even were. The man listened, then slowly said, "You shouldn't be here." We all looked at each other. I'm sure the others thought the same as me. "No shit, we shouldn't be here. We just told you that." He continued to look at us from one to the other, as though sizing us up. I was starting to get a little uncomfortable with his silence. I would have thought he would offer to guide us, but he didn't. He kept staring. I think everyone else was getting a little edgy as well when Dean asked if he could point us in the right direction. He looked at Dean as if deciding to answer him or not. "I can guide you," he said, "but first you should have some rest." We all agreed that the day had been long and stressful. We decided to take his advice and turn in. We offered him some food and water, but he refused, saying he wasn't hungry. We each went to our tents and laid down. Before I settled in and finished this note, I popped my head back out of my tent to check on our guide. He was sitting by the fire staring into the orange coals. I thought I heard him mumbling or maybe humming something softly. I quietly zipped up my tent and went to sleep. Some time later, someone banged on my tent. I woke and unzipped it to find the ranger with a strange look in his eyes. "We need to go." "Why?" I said, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes. "It's not safe here," he said with an edge of panic in his voice. I popped back into my tent to change, then came out and met with everyone. They were all in states of semi-consciousness as well. Everyone but the ranger seemed to be confused. "Pack up. We need to leave," he said a little more forcefully. I was about to protest when I heard a piercing scream in the distance. His head shot up and he stared in the direction of the sound. "Move it," he said. "Pack up." What did need to be told again? The scream brought us all fully awake. We tore down our tents in record time and packed everything into our backpacks. As I was finishing up, I noticed Devon's tent was still up. "Where's Devon?" I said. "Who's Devon?" the ranger said. "As another one of our friends," I said. "He went off into the woods alone right before you got here. He didn't come back," the ranger said. "Should we go look for him?" I said. The ranger extended his arms and did a slow circle. "Which way would you go?" he said. I understood his point. How would we know where he had gone, if he was still on the path or not? It just seemed like we should do something. "What about his gear?" I said. "Do we take it with us?" The ranger looked at me like he was a no at having to answer such questions. "Leave it here in case he comes back," he said. "He'll need his supplies." I'm not sure if he'll keep leaving notes or not now that we have the ranger to guide us. Whoever finds this, please look for Devon and make sure he's okay. A ranger. All the rangers at this park are in their 30s or 40s. Maybe it was someone who retired and was just roaming around out there. But why would he be in a ranger outfit? Sitting here by the dying embers of the fire, with a tent set up in front of me, it was very tempting to take a rest. If they're in the hands of a capable ranger, I could get some rest before the long hike back out of here, but I knew I had already taken my rest for the night. If not for that, I would have been here hours ago, probably before the other ranger. I set out again, feeling tired but determined. The campsite made me more hopeful than I had been all day. At least they were together and thinking like campers. If only I knew who this ranger was. The sun was an hour away from rising, so I took out my flashlight to follow the trail. I zipped up the tent before I left, just in case its owner did come back. Wouldn't want animals getting in and taking everything. It's bad enough when injured park rangers do it. The trail stayed level for a while as dawn peeked over the trees. The trail started heading upward, which was bad news for me and my bum ankle. It made things harder, but I had my trusty makeshift crutch to help me. Dawn crept into the forest, giving me a little assistance. At least I wouldn't have to waste a hand holding a flashlight. As the climb grew steeper, the trail grew more narrow. At times it was only the width of 1 foot. I held onto trees and whatever I could as I scaled the extremely narrow trail. At the most difficult, I paused and seriously considered turning back. As I looked around for any other way to keep going, I saw brightly colored fabric at the bottom of the ravine. I carefully balanced as I took out my binoculars and looked. It was a backpack, and attached to it was the body of a girl in her early 20s. She looked like she had hit her head on the rocks at the bottom. Her face was bloody and mauled. Her clothes were ripped and soaked in blood. There was no doubt an animal had gotten to her. The only question was she alive when it started feeding on her? I looked away, but felt my determination double to find these missing kids. They might be with a ranger, but they were still in terrible danger. I slowly continued up the narrow trail. At times I was sure the ground would give out from under me, and I would share the same fate as the poor unfortunate girl at the bottom of the ravine. It was then I remembered my radio. I tried to call in and report the location of the body, but the only response I got was static. I determined to try again when I got to the top of the trail. It was yet another motivation to keep going, to be careful, to survive. It seemed like hours at a snail's pace, working my way up the side of that ravine. Finally, I clawed my way over the edge to the top. I rolled over onto solid ground and lay there for a few minutes. Once I caught my breath, I got up slowly and painfully. I hadn't done my ankle any favors. I limped toward what looked like the trail and began following. It wasn't long before I came across the remnants of another campsite. The fire was a little warmer than the last one. I stoked it up, threw some more wood on, and got it going. I knew I needed some rest. I searched around and found a note, then sat down on a log by the fire to read it. I can't believe Adrienne's gone. We started up this steep ravine, and the trail kept getting more narrow. I asked the ranger if there was any other way around, but he just glared at me and said no. We all struggled with our heavy packs on our backs. At one point I was on all fours, just trying to keep from sliding into the ravine. That's when it happened. Adrienne was having trouble keeping her feet on the trail. She kept slipping. I reached out and helped her balance a few times. Being right in front of me, I kept an eye on her whenever I could. That wasn't nearly as much as I wanted because I was watching my own feet. She slipped once, and I tried to grab her, but she had tipped over, and the weight of her backpack dragged her over the side. I watched in horror as she tumbled down into the ravine, bouncing off trees as she went. I saw her skull make a solid impact several times as she tumbled to the bottom and slid to a stop. I couldn't see if she was still breathing or not as I called her name. She did move. I called for the ranger in front of us and pointed to her unmoving body. He stared at her for a long time. I don't know if he was trying to see if she was alive or not. He told us to keep going up the trail to the top, and he would go check on her. I watched as he carefully made his way down the nearly sheer slope. We kept moving forward as instructed. He was only halfway down when we made it to the top. I was a wreck. I was so happy we made it, but sad for Adrienne. I didn't hold out much hope that the ranger was going to come. Trotting into camp with her on his back, saying she only had a few bumps and bruises. We started a fire and then sat around it in a stupor. Finally, Terry came over and talked to me. "Look, I understand she was your friend, but she was ours too," he said. "We need to work together to get out of here for them." "That's so stupid it makes sense," I said with the remnants of a smile. It was then the ranger reappeared. He sat by the fire and didn't say a word. There was something in his eyes. It wasn't sadness, but I don't know exactly what it was. We knew she was coming back. We rested for a little while, then started out on the trail again. "If you're following us, I hope you're being careful. Stay safe. Wow, this girl is something else. With all she's gone through, she still wants me to be safe. I hope I find her. I think she'd make a good ranger." My guilty conscience jumped up on my back and yelled at me. "How can you sit around and rest when that poor girl just lost her friend and needs your help?" I knew it was right. I just didn't know why that other ranger was being so careless. I struggled to get up, kicked out the fire, and started after them. The daylight was dimming, but it was only 8 in the morning. I looked up and saw why. Storm clouds were overtaking the sky. Yet another reason I wish I would have brought my backpack. The raindrops hit like a cold slap in the face, even though it was still September. Out here in the mountains, the weather can change in a heartbeat. We weren't at the top of the mountain, but in the middle was enough for the weather change to make me shiver. Now that we were out of the ravine, I tried my radio again, but it was just static. I knew there were some places where the radio inexplicably wouldn't work. I just hoped to get away from the interference before it was too late. The trail was clear in front of me, but that was little comfort when walking in open fields with no rain cover. All those trees I tromped through, and now in the rain, I have wide open spaces. I'd say someone doesn't like me. The rain did just pass like a spring shower. It poured so hard it became difficult to see in front of me. For a long time I trudged through the rain. At times it felt like I was walking in place. The mud was starting to cake on my boots, and then my salvation appeared. In front of me on the trail was a tent. I called out before I unzipped the tent and let myself in. I flopped to the wonderful dry floor, then quickly turned and zipped the entrance back up. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I did, a stench assaulted my nose. I looked over at the sleeping bag. It was full. "I'm sorry to barge in like this, but I needed to get out of the rain," I said. No response. I nudged the person in the bag. It tipped to the side and rocked right back. That's when I noticed the splotches of red that had soaked through the bag. I didn't want to see, but I pulled the top of the sleeping bag away from the person's face. The bad part was they no longer had a face. It had been ripped away, and the neck had been gouged out. There were large wounds on the body as well. I tried to feel for a pulse, but when my fingers went straight into the muscles of the neck, I figured there was no pulse to feel. I wiped my fingers on the sleeping bag and pondered why this person was covered. I know the animal who did this didn't gently cover up the person with a sleeping bag when it was done. I found my answer laying above the head of the person. It was a note. I can't believe Terry's dead. I wish ID never come on this trip. I wish ID never let Devin bully us into turning down this damn trail. Where the hell is Devin anyway? When he stormed off on his little pity party, did he run across whatever creature has been stalking us? Is he sitting back in his tent, not enjoying himself? I really don't know. We were enjoying not climbing up the face of a ravine, but we were very tired. I mentioned stopping and camping for a little bit to the ranger. He looked around and even sniffed the air. That seemed like a weird thing to do, but after that he agreed to let us set up camp. He even told us to do it as quickly as we could. We gathered wood for a fire, but he told us not to bother because the rain was coming. I guess that explains the sniffing the air thing. Our tents had been up maybe 15 minutes when it started raining. It quickly turned into a downpour. We all offered the ranger to sit in our tents with us. He looked over us one by one. It was kinda creepy. Finally, he said he would sit with Terry in his tent. Dean and I looked at each other with relieved expressions. The ranger is helping us, but he isn't someone I'd like to ever see again. He just acts weird. At times I wonder if he's really helping. I'd just close my eyes listening to the rain on the tent and letting it carry me off to dreamland. When the ranger ripped open my tent, he said we needed to pack up and leave right now. That something was hunting us. We dove out into the rain and miserably packed our tents. He reassured us that there was a cave nearby and we could get shelter there. As I was packing up, I didn't see Terry, so I went over to his tent and knocked. When there was no answer, I went in and found what was left of his body. Something had torn him to shreds. I covered my mouth to keep from vomiting and ran out to tell the others. Dean and the ranger looked in and saw that there was no helping him. The ranger said he had left the tent to go to the bathroom, and when he came back he saw a predator hanging around the tents. That's when he came and woke us. It must have already gotten to Terry. I pulled his sleeping bag over his head and wished we had time to give him a proper burial. But the ranger said the animal might be back for the rest of us. So we quickly packed and left. I barely had time to finish this note. Please help us. A cave? What kind of ranger is he? Doesn't he realize that would be the most likely place a large predator would call home? I thought for a moment what cave he could be talking about. I hadn't been on this trail for 5 years. Ever since I found the kid here, then it hit me. We were very close to the place where we found him. Why would he take them there unless? I jumped up so quickly that I nearly fell on top of the body, and I forgot and put too much weight on my injured ankle. I hobbled out of the tent and went as quickly as I could toward the place I swore I'd never see again. I approached the cave and my heart sank. The backpack sat just inside the entrance. I pulled out my knife and flashlight, then cautiously peeked inside. I felt a change in the breeze and turned to find the ranger staring at me. I looked him up and down. "You," I said, "the last time I saw you was when we found the boy." He said nothing. "It was never a random animal attack," I said. It was you." He took a step toward me. "Of course it was," he said. "How wonderful was it to watch you years ago as you floundered around looking for some predator that stood beside you. You son of Abbage." I pulled out my knife and held it ready. He paused, then smiled. "Do you really think that knife can hurt me?" I looked at it. "Pretty sure," I said. "It's made of iron." His smile vanished. "So you do know what I am." I pulled out a bottle of brown water. "I made sure to grab some runoff from the rainstorm," I said. "It might not do as good as rust water, but let's find out." I opened the bottle and threw some water at him. He dodged it as though it was acid. At the same time I swung with the knife, he dodged with ease. "Why don't you turn into the big pussy that you are?" I said, taunting him. "Because we both know when I transform invulnerable for a moment," he said, "and am sure you would love to take advantage of a vulnerable moment." He swung and connected with my stomach, knocking the wind out of me. I recovered and swung the knife in a vicious downswing at him, which he easily dodged. I kept moving forward, stabbing and slashing at him. I couldn't get close enough to connect. He was too fast. "You can't defeat me," he said. "Look at you, like an injured deer just waiting to be devoured." "Be quiet, yin old Lucy," I yelled. At the mention of his name he froze. I knew I didn't have much time. I took advantage of the moment, lunging at him with my knife. If I had been uninjured, I would have closed the distance between us with 2 quick steps and buried the knife in his heart. Unfortunately, in the heat of the moment, I forgot about my injured ankle. I stepped forward on my good leg, then faltered when I tried to put weight on the injured one. Instead of burying the knife in his heart, it went through his left thigh. He screamed in pain and ran out of the cave. I took out my flashlight and started toward the back of the cave. There I found a mutilated body next to a pile of bones. There was a note in her hand. I sat down, took it, and read. "I can't believe how stupid I was not to see this much sooner. All the time guiding us was just a ploy. He never wanted to help us. He never cared about any of us or our safety. I need to write this quickly before he comes back. The ranger led us here and told us to wait. That would be safe in the cave. He left us alone." Dean pulled out his flashlight and explored deeper into the cave. He found a large pile of bones. Off to the side of them was a pile of clothes. We ran toward the opening, but the ranger had returned. "So you didn't listen," he said, leering at us. "I told you to stay here, not explore my home." "What are you?" I said. He smiled for the first time since I met him, but his smile wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. I watched in horror as he changed into a giant cat creature. It did look quite like a panther or mountain lion. He lunged at us with amazing speed. He grabbed my leg and tore a large gash in it. I fell to the floor screaming. Dean tried to defend me, swinging his knife around and holding it at bay, but it stalked around him and cornered him. He only had one chance. He looked at me with sadness in his eyes, and then ran past the creature and out of the cave. It looked at me and my leg, then sprinted out after Dean. I know why he did it. He was trying to give me time to escape, but with my leg, there was no way I could outrun that thing. What he actually did was give me time to say goodbye. If you're reading this, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I led you to your death. If you do somehow survive and make it out of here, please tell our families what really happened here. Goodbye. I fought back tears as I read the final words of this brave girl. I limped to the front of the cave and looked out as the rain stopped. It was like seeing a new world being born. I tried my radio and got an immediate answer. I gave them my GPS coordinates and told them to prepare for casualties. I'm still a park ranger even months later. I made sure that the trail was sealed off. I carry an iron knife and rust water with me at all times. I carry the rust water and a squirt gun, just in case. The bones were removed from the cave and subjected to DNA testing. Aside from this group of victims, including Devon, there were several other people who had gone missing in the park over the years. The official version of the events was that a rogue animal had been hunting people. I was told it would be best for my career if I didn't reveal the true nature of the predator. I still search for the creature and post signs everywhere to be on the lookout for an older ranger, wearing a uniform with no patches on it. There's a number to call if anyone spots him. It's my personal cell phone number. From time to time I hear reports of a large cat that's limping on its hind leg. I try to make my way to that spot as quickly as possible, but I have yet to catch him. I posted this story in memory of that brave girl, but also as a warning. Never go on an unposted trail, and beware of those you meet in the woods, even if they wear a uniform.